Can you see the shared screen, the mimer?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Okay. So last week we spoke about the Indian of Mala Mata in the sefiros, and he explained that the Indian of Mala Mata has to do with Indian ribuy and mute. In other words, the more oil there is, the more the higher the Indian is, the less oil there is. That's the Indian of Mata. However, I explained last week that he's not necessarily talking about kamus, but more he's talking about echus. And we'll see that in today's perek in particular, that here we're talking about the Indian of echus. It's not just an Indian of kamus. Kamus comes about as a result of the echus, but the echus, in other words, the quality of the oil is the ikar thing that decides what's mala and what's mata. And because of the quality of the oil, therefore there's more of a riboy oil. And this is what he's going to explain in perek Lamed Ches.
Moshe, do you think he's the reason why he's focusing on this? Like in Netanya, Alter Rebbe repeats it in a few places that he wants to make sure that people don't understand it in a physical sense, Milo Mata.
I'm sure that has something to do with it, yeah.
Or here we're assuming that the reader is already sophisticated enough.
You know what? I mean, the emphasis, if we're talking about Ayin Beis, but they're called the reader sophisticated enough. I mean, Ayin Beis is not it's not a sefer for beginners, and therefore we could assume that everybody would understand this. But nevertheless, he has to explain this. He will explain this Inyan that obviously we're not talking about malu mata in the physical sense of it, but I mean, it's more or less self-understood for anyone who has a little sophistication in Chassidus, but nevertheless, he's going to explain it more as we will see.
Mm-hmm.
So he was talking about the Inyan al Malu Mata, and he's going to explain now that this is particularly in the gather of Hishtalshlus sefiros zemizeh. In other words, in any particular olam, how the sefiros are mishtalshel zemizeh, that's really essentially what we've been talking about, and he's going to explain this in greater detail. What we've been talking about is the Indian of sefiros, and similarly with the Indian of the bringing about of one world from another. In other words, Bria from Atzilus, and Yetzirah from Bria, and Asiya from Yetzirah, and so on and so forth. Why is that so? So he's going to explain. In order for there to be a sphere that emerges from a lower sphere that emerges from the higher sphere, well, they mute or that has to come about through mute or. In other words, if it was the same madrega of or as the higher madrega, then it wouldn't emerge. Like it wouldn't need to emerge. It has to have a lower madrega in order to emerge as an independent, or not an independent, but a different sphere. And this is what he's going to explain weiter. Like we see when it comes to Bina emerging from Chochmah. And you may argue that, in fact, all of the spheres have their own shayrish, but essentially the oyer is mishtalshel from Chochmah to Bina. Why? Because otherwise Bina, if we understand it in Seichel, if the Indian of Chochmah is the etzem nekuda of the Indian, the etzem nekuda samuskal, right? Bina is the biur of the etzem nekudas hamuskal. So if it's not related to the etzem nekudas hamuskal, if it doesn't come from there, then it's not explaining the etzem nekudas hamuskal, right? So it must start off with that's its starting point. Yes, it's on a low madrega because it comes into the categories of analysis and thought and so on and so forth. It's a low madrega. It's not the etzem nekuda. It's the hispashtus nekuda into Bina, but nevertheless, there's a relationship between Chochmah and Bina over here, between the Etzem Nakuda and his Pashtus of the Nakuda. So again, Kamo Ishtaushel Zabin Ma Chochmah, while they mute or within Chochmah Atzmo, through reduction of the or of Chokhmah, because if the or of Chokhmah was to shine the way it is, Bina would never be able to appear, so to speak. That if the Gilu in Chokhmah itself was all equal, he's talking about in the sphere itself, there's madregas within each sphere, within Chokhmah itself, that is going to be able to lead to the Indian of Bina. So, in other words, if all of Chokhmah was one oyer, one single oyer, then the sphere of Chokhmah would never be able to be mashpia on a lower madrega. Why? Because all the oyer, there would be no sort of precedence within Chokhmah itself for the Indian of outreach to a lower madrega. Therefore, in Chokhmah itself, you have different madregas. You have Chokhmah of Chokhmah, you have Bin of Chokhmah, Midos of Chokhmah, until eventually you get Malchus of Chokhmah. And that's what he's referring to now. When we say, so first he talks about the Indian of the Hishtalshlus HaSfira within itself. And in Olam HaTikun, in Olam HaToyu, as we explained in the previous parak, but in Olam HaTikun, each Madrega has all of the madregas within it. So there's Chokhmah, Bin of Chokhmah, or we can start off with Kesef Chokhmah, Bin of Chokhmah, and so on all the way through until you get Malchus of Chokhmah. So again, he explains now that in Chokhmah itself, that's where the miuta or occurs. That it was all equal all throughout Chokhmah. Bina would never have been emanated from Chokhmah. Through the or being reduced within Chokhmah itself, that's called Yesoid Abba. Yesod is sort of the outreach, the union of the Yesod corresponding to the male organ is also the union of outreach. That's how the male is Mazriya to the female, and similarly, therefore, the union of Yesod Abba is how it's Mazriya, it's in your name to a lower, to a different madrega, to a lower madrega, in this particular case, to Bina. That's what brings about the emanation of Bina. Ki Abba be'etzem, in other words, Abba as it is in its atzmus, Chokhmah of Chokhmah, or the without subdivisions within Chokhmah itself. Ki Abba be'etzem da'anu atzmus HaChokhmah, hagam shi gam ken yediyah, harizel lamali miseichel hamusag. It transcends seichel that can be understood and grasped. It's the etzem nakuda, and it can't be put into the categories of thought until it's reduced onto lower madrega, into the Indian Bina. As he explains, could not possibly have come into Bina. Through miuta or on the lower madregas of Chokhmah, but madregas hatachtoin is the Chokhmah. In other words, bechinas nehi netzach od yesod the Abba yachol yos atzilus abina me'achokhmah. You can have bina emanating from Chokhmah through the lower sefiros of Chokhmah itself. Therefore, the or in bina is reduced, and therefore it can be manifested in a different manner than the or of Chokhmah. Similarly, with Zoh, the 6 sefiros Moichin, Zeu Gam Kentavka all them Yuta, or same thing. Shema Madrega Tachtoina, the Chokhmah Bina, from the lower Madregas Chokhmah Bina, in other words, Nehi of Bina, yeah, Atzilus Azo. That's how Zoh is emanated. How is Biyah? Miatzilus, and it's not only in sefiros that it's like this, but it's also in olamos that it's like this. In order to have biyah emerging from atzilus, in atzilus itself, mizmaita, or the or itself becomes reduced in olam atzilus. In other words, in olam atzilus you have madregas, you have chokhmah atzilus, you have bina atzilus, until malchus of atzilus, and therefore from malchus of atzilus you have the possibility, since there's already a miuta or of that or being nimshach lamata into olam habriya. So it's again misma'at or madrega lamadrega. The bimaya or b'shava b'chol madregas hatzilus. If it was equal everywhere, in other words, all the oil of hatzilus was all one madrega. Shegam b'chinas hamalchus. She's sofer the kol dargin. Then even that malchus too, which is in the way things are now, it's called sefer the kol dargin, the lowest of the madregas in chokhmah. The Atzilus by Riboy HaOr, if there was in Malchus Riboy HaOr like there is in Chochmah, that would not have been possible for Biyah to be brought about, Bria Tzirasiyah. Kim Davkal and then Mute HaOr. There has to be the Inyan of mute. And we'll see shortly that this mute, again, is not only a quantitative thing, but a qualitative thing, as he'll explain shortly. Kim Dafka de Muta or Yachol Yosis Habus. Then there could be the creation, the bringing about of the low madregas. And even though the Hisabus is Ba'en Aroch, meaning to say, what does it mean that it's Ba'en Aroch? In other words, Olam Abriya is Ba'en Aroch to Atzilus, as we know. Ad Kadei Kach, that you would say that Bria is Mishtalshel Yesh Mi Ayin. Atzilus is Bechinas Ayin, and Bria is Bechinas Yesh. It's the Inin of Nivra. Masha'ain Kain Chochma is not Nivra, it's Netzal. So it's on a different madrega. It's Bechinas Ayin, Lagabe, the Yesh of Bria. Not only Inyan, essentially of Kalim, but Poyol Mamish, only starts really in Bria. It doesn't start in Atzilus. The Inyan of the Kalim of Atzilus are Bechinas Elokus. Right? Iwa Chayoy Ichad, Iwa Gamoy Ichad, as Alter explains in Perichof in Igeres HaKodesh, even the Keilim Bechinas Chad, the Bechinas Achtus, the Bechinas Elokus, in Olam Atzilus, Masha'en Kani Bria, the Keilim are already Bechinas Nivra, even though it's a very refined Nivra, but nevertheless Bechinas Nivra. That's why it's called Bria. So again, Mikol Makom Tzarich Loim, Masha'ayin Ye Be'erech Yois Memeno His Habus HaYesh. Nevertheless, it's not Ayin in such a manner that it's not shaykh at all to the Bria. It's not Efes. It's Bechinas Ayin before the Yesh. V'achochmem Ayin Timotzei comes out of Keser, but it's nevertheless Nimtza, it's Timotzei Miha Ayin. In other words, there is some erech between this Ayin and what comes out of it, what emerges from it. But nevertheless, it's regarded as Bechinas Ayin. And therefore, what comes out is, in a sense, Yesh Mi Ayin, at least in a relative sense. And this is because, or by virtue of the fact that in Atzilus itself, the oil within Atzilus itself is reduced from madrega to madrega, from chokhmah to bina, from bina to midas, from midas to malchus, and so on. Ad b'chidas malchus. As efshar liyez b'chidas malchus is habus hayesh de biyah. Then there could be the yesh of biyah from the ayin of Atzilus. Whole zehu li'inyan istah hishtaushlu is habus shalamayla. Sorry, shalamayla mata hu b'chinas rivu miyuta or. All of this is talking about the inyan vishtaushlu, where we're discussing the inyan of mute and riboy, or riboy and mute. Riboy or l'chayr we mean bekamus, and mute or we mean bekamus, in other words, more or less. But he now explains that it's not the inyan of kamus, it's the dafka, the inyan of echus. He's going to explain that. That's what we're going to get into now. Aval be'etzem ha'inyan, the malomata, the essential inyan of malomata, ba'olamos v'sefiros, whether you're talking about olamos, whether you're talking about sefiros, ein ze bechinas ha'mayla rak ma shamadrega elyoina hi bechinas riboy ha'or. It's not just that the high madrega is bechinas riboy ha'or legaba ha'madrega ha'tachtoina. It's not just the inyan of kamus. Rak ha'mayla umatu be'etzem madrega san. It's the inyan of echus, as I was explaining all along. The ikar inyan of malomata is the madrega, the inyan, the eichus of the higher madrega is such that it's be'etzem higher than the lower madrega. As he explained, Shai Elyon hu l'mal b'madrega soy be'etzem yatachton. The Elyon is automatically mitzad what it is, mitzad its mahus. It's on a higher madrega than the tachton. It's not just that the tachton is a reduction in kamus. It's a reduction in eichus. It's a different type of eichus. It's as a result of its eichus, there's also more of a riboy or on that madrega. Since chokhmah is a higher inyan be'etzem than bina, therefore there's more oil in chokhmah than there is in bina. And as he explains now in the parentheses, the fact that there's a riboy and miut in the or that chokhmah lagabe bina is b'chinas riboy and bina is b'chinas miut is because there's a difference in the eichus of their madregas. Mitzad etza hamala mata be'etza madregas, and there's a difference in their etza madrega. The sefiros who ma'ila be'etzem, the sphere which is on a higher level, madregas and meya be'etza madregas, that it's etza madrega meir ba riboy ha'or va'or gamken elyon be'madrega. It's a higher madrega of or. In other words, the eichus is a different eichus. It's a higher madrega in eichus, not just kamus. And the mata is on a madrega of miuta or, and we explained what he means. It's not only that the tzimtzum is the what brings about the miut and the helem. As we explained before, there has to be a miut at the end of the madregas of chokhmah, at the end of the madrega ha'elyoina, whatever the madrega ha'elyoina is. In order for the lower madrega to be created, that the distance between them, that's the cause of the miut. It's not only that, that's not the only inyan. In other words, the fact that chokhmah is on a higher madrega because it has more oil, and bina is on a lower madrega because it's further away and therefore has less oil, because as the oil is yored mishtalshel, it's misma'et. That's not the only inyan. Kim shamadrega hatachtoina mipnei shi be'etzem tachtoin b'madrega zeu sibas miut behelem or. That's why there's a miut in the or, because it's on a lower madrega. And that's why the higher madrega is an inyan of eichus. Its eichus is a much higher madrega than the madrega below it. Something that's be'etzem on a higher madrega, mitzad shorish makoira, because of its shorish makor. In other words, chokhmah, which comes right out of keseh. Therefore, ne'etzlav b'chinas kiruv. It's emanated in the way of kiruv to its makor, and that would be the ultimate makor that we're talking about. Of all the or pnimi is the kav, and therefore it comes from a higher madrega in the kav. The closer the kav is to the or ein sof, the kav, as we mentioned before, is nogeya to the or ein sof, is nogeya to the or of the igul hagodol. The igul hagodol is the or that was b'chinas ispashtus in the halal, and then that or is removed up to higher madrega, to the madrega which is begilu la'atzmoi, not begilu olamos. And therefore, when the kav emerges from that or from the or of the igul hagodol, and the closer it is to the igul hagodol, the more the giloy and the higher the giloy. Therefore, who begins hariboy or v'hagiloy? The elyoina shel kav is on a higher madrega of or and giloy. A madrega shi tachtoina be'etzem ne'etzla v'chins richuk v'chins miut v'helem. And therefore, it's on a much lower madrega, miut and helem, a reduction and a concealment of the or as it comes further and further down. All right, we'll see when we get there what he says in Perek Mem Daled about this inyan as well. As we find in the olamos in general, obviously the world prior to Atzilus on a higher madrega than olam Atzilus. Why are they on a high madrega? Because their es madrega is higher, they're higher up in the kav, so to speak. Above Atzilus in the world of Adam Kadmon, for example, or in the various madregas in Adam Kadmon, which would be akudim, nikudim, right? Akudim and nikudim. There's meir the atzmus hakav rather than only ha'ora of the kav. Again, harizeh lamala be'etzem madrega san v'hu shalamayim ha'atzilus Meir atzmus hakav. Above Atzilus, you have the etzem hakav. Mashen ken in Atzilus, it's only ha'oras hakav. Ubatzilus, Atzilus, and Arak ha'oras hakav levad. Shezeu ilu godol ma'oil be'etzem mahus ha'or shel ma'alim ha'atzilus. And that you can see is a tremendous difference between the or of Atzilus and the or l'malim ha'atzilus. The olamos l'malim ha'atzilus are in such a madrega because that's the mahus ha'or. Masha ein kain olam ha'atzilus is only a ziv. It's only a ha'or of the or. Now I'll explain later that it's mahus haziv. It's not just a ha'ora da or it's mahus haziv. It's the actual ziv itself, but nevertheless it's a ziv and ha'ora, as opposed to what comes before atzilus, which is mamish the etzem ha'or. And that's the mahus ha'or rather, not the etzem ha'or, the mahus ha'or rather than the metzius ha'or, as I'll explain. So again, shezeu ilu godol ma'od be'etzem mahus ha'or shelamal me'atzilus shelamal me'atzilus hu mahus va'atzbus ha'or. U'atzilus hu b'chinas giloy ha'metzius levad. It's only that there is oil, but not the oil itself. It's the fact that there is oil is the inyan, the gilui and atzilus. It's the oil itself that's the gilui. It's not just the metzius levad, it's the inyan of the mahusa oil. It's like existence as opposed to essence. Right, there's a concept this concept is explained in Hasidus in multiple makoimis, the difference between the etzem of something and the metzius of something. The metzius of something is, for example, just let's use a simple example, something like electricity. The fact that there's an inyan of electricity, the metzius of electricity, means that you can you can plug your phone and you can charge it. You can plug your light in and have light in the house and so on and so forth. That's mitzad the metzius of electricity in your house. But that doesn't explain what the mahus of electricity is. That the mahus of electricity, there was electrons and this and that, and how they're produced and how they flow down wires and this and that and the other. The mahus is a whole different ball game. Where it's produced, where the mahus is produced, is like in the generator. You can't plug your phone into a generator; you'll blow your phone completely, right? It has to be brought down into a madrega of metzius, where it's already reduced to such an extent that when you plug your phone in, it's not going to blow the phone completely into smithereens. Okay, so same point over here. Legabe the mahusa or which is the ma'alme atzilus, legabe the metzius or which is atzilus itself. Okay, so it continues. The or which is in itself a giloy of etzem, the hanushu b'chinas ein sof. As we know, there's different madregas in the or. There's etzem or and hispashtus or, right? In the hispashtus or there's also two madregas. The etzem or is not begiloy. Then in the hispashtus or there's two madregas. Giloy ha'or shebegilu la'atzmoy, the or which is only begilu ta'akadosh baruch Hu, and there's the or ha'shayich la'olamas, the or that it's not begilu la'olamas yet, but at least it's shayich la'olamas. In that or ha'shayich la'olamas, that's where the timtum was, and that's the kavis extends essentially from there, and so on and so forth. But here we're talking about etzem ha'or, etzem ha'gilui, and that's bechinas ein sof. Harurak bechinas, where are we? Gamma or shu bechinas gilo ha'etzem. The or which is a gilui of the, in other words, not a gilui, it's not the etzem gilui, it's a gilui from the etzem. But nevertheless, hainu shu bechinas ein sof. Harurak bechinas betzius levad. Since the gilui from the etzem, I think I said it a little bit wrong previously. Forgive me. That chiluk doesn't really apply here. What we were saying is there's the etzem or and there's the gilui from the etzem or. The gilui is afal that the gilui itself is ein sof. The or hakav and the or hashayich lo'olamis is an or ein sof. Nevertheless, it's only the bechinas metzius of the or and not the mahus or. Okay, so that's misgale before olamis atzilus. V'hainu she'or megale rak metzius ha'ma'or v'lo etzem mahus. This oir, the oir that's his pashtus oir, is only megale that there is a makor called the Ein Sof, the ma'or. But it's not megale the ma'or itself. It's only megale that there's a makor. And he speaks about this in several memorim. I think it's Samachvav is one of them, and there's various others. When it comes along the olam atzilus, which is only the ha'ora, the radiance of the cup, it's only metzius lagabe mahus. Only what? So he says in brackets over here, but don't make a mistake. There's different madregas in the metzius of the ora as well. There's mahus haziv, mahus ha'ora, and then there's a lower madrega than that. So in atzilus, it's the mahus ha'ora. Atzilus meir mahus haziv, right? The mahus haziv. In other words, even though it's a ziv, but nevertheless, it's the ziv itself. It's not some other inyan. It's not the ha'ora da ha'ora, which is what is in the other olamos. Sefiros atzilus musag mahus haziv. As explained elsewhere, if you have the new version of Ayin Beis, you can see the footnotes, and I'll tell you where the Maram HaKoyim are. Lochein, Lochein HaMadregas Shelamal Atzilus, and therefore those madregas that go beyond Atzilus, Hein bebechinas Helem legamrei, they are bebechinas Helem to us. Why? Because we're talking about Mahus Ha'or. The beginning of Gilu is only in Olam Atzilus. The Mahus of the Or is not Begilui to us. It's only Begilui to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. While Yois ki Agilu ba'olamas urak bechinas hametzius to Oren Sof Baruch Hu, and not the Mahus. The Atzmus Oren Sof leis machshov tfiza beklal, that when we're talking about Atzmus Ein Sof, no machshov can grasp him at all. Or Cain, Atzilus the beginning of Gilu. Umashalamal mi Atzilus, shezeh bechinas Atzmus, hazeh bechinas Helem. It's bechinas Helem to us. Obviously, it's not bechinas Helem to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Chayma madrega shalamal mi Atzilus gufa, the bechinas Ak, moved al be'erech ma'adrega shalamata mimeno. Ak is in a bechinas havdola from Atzilus, and from all the other madregas that emerge ultimately from Ak. Shahar Nikra Adam Kadmoin. It's the inyan of Kadmoin meaning prior to, not obviously in terms of Zman, although we do speak about it in terms of temporal terms, in other words, in terms of Zman, but obviously in terms of Madrega. That's much more what we mean, rather than in terms of Zman. In fact, we can't really talk about it in terms of Zman because Zman wasn't even created at that point in time. Zman is a creation, and it only happens on Olam Madregas. There's not even Zman in Olam Atzilus. There's only Zman from Olam Bria and downwards, the inyan of time. Why? Because that's where there's Rotz of Shoiv, and without getting into it now, that's how time is defined by Rotz of Shoiv. In any event, Tepirush Ak, Adam Kadmoin, Shezeu Bechinas Adam, She'ala B'machshava B'orein Sof Kadmon L'chol HaKedumim. Why is it called Adam Kadmoin? Because it's the tziyur that arose in the mind of the Orein Sof, so to speak, and he, the Orein Sof, is Kadmon L'chol HaKedumim, precedes everything, right? Kadmon L'chol HaKedumim. The B'tzelem Elokim Asa Yasa Adam, and he made the Olam of Adam Kadmoin at Tziyur Adam, but B'tzelem Elokim. Now, interestingly enough, there are various memorim where he explains the Loshen Tzelem Elokim is Bedafka. It's not Tzelem Havaya, because it's not possible to make a Tzelem of Shem Havaya, but only in Tzelem Elokim, the inyan of Tzimtzum, is it possible to talk about the inyan of Tzelem. Tzelem meaning some kind of form of one sort or another. But Tzelem Elokim, Asa Yasa Adam, that can only be after the Tzimtzum and not before. Ukashem Shu Kadum, just as the Kodesh Baruch Hu is Kadum, Kach Gam Machshavta Ikaduma, so too is Machshava Kadum. And therefore, Adam Adam Kadmoin is called Kadmoin because it arose in a sort of of the Kadum L'chol HaKadumim, that there should be such an inyan, such a world called Adam Kadmoin, and it is nevertheless has a certain tziyur, it's B'Tselem Elokim. Vayin Mashikasa B'Drush Gimel Mini Adam, which is in, I think in Gimel Mini Adam, the Torah, or look at the Torah from the Alter Rebbe, Gimel Mini Adam. The Ak, more Adam HaRishon. Ak is like Adam HaRishon, Shayatir Kapap Shal HaKadosh Baruch Hu, created directly by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, by the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak. Mokain Ba'ak, HaKelim Hein Me'or Sof Baruch Hu. So too with Ak, the Kelim themselves are from the Or Ein Sof. But no madregas in between. There's no mamutza. Shlo Oidem Tzois Ezer madregas. There's no other madregas in between. Ak was created directly by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Being came move on, the Gama or the Ak. If the Kelim or Yetzir Kapap Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, in the way that that Ak could be called Yetzir Kapap Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Im came move on, the Gam HaOr the Ak, Hu Lamar Lahar by Be'ez Madregasoy, the Gam HaOirois Shalamata Mimeno. Ak is obviously therefore on a much higher madrega than all of the inyonim that are below olam, the olam of Ak. In other words, starting down from Atzilus and downwards. Yesh lo imar, we could say, like we said before, shezeu gamken atzmus v'ha'ora. It's a difference between etzem ha'or, in other words, the etzem of the or, not etzem ha'or as a madrega, etzem v'spashtus, but rather it's the etzem rather than the ha'ora. It's the or itself rather than the ha'ora of the or. The ha'ora of the or is already in Atzilus. And ha'ora da ha'ora in Bria Yitzir and Asiya. Ha'ora da ha'ora. Masha ein kain in Ak, it's the union of Atzmus ha'or. Shari kol ha'giluim shemei Ak, nikraim havolim da Ak. They're called havolim. Havolim is something, a hevel is a davar she'en bo mamash. Right? Hevel means really, essentially means the breath. But in Koheles, when it says hevel havolim, so it's explained in Sifrei Kabbalah that that's talking about the inyonim of Adam Kadmon, the various madregas of Or that are mizgala from Adam Kadmon. Those are called the havolim. It's explained in Eitz Chaim that there are several havolim. There's the einaim oizen choitem peh. Now, obviously, from the peh and the choitem, there's obviously havolim. Yeah, the hevel, breath comes out of the mouth, comes out of the nose, and so on and so forth. But how do you see the union of breath coming out of the ears and out of the eyes? So Arizal says something very interesting. He says if you hold your nose and your mouth, and you close your nose and your mouth, and you push the air out, you hear a popping in your ears. That popping in your ears proves that there's avir or havolim that comes out of your ears as well. What about out of your eyes? It says the fact that when a person closes his eyes and he goes to sleep or whatever, and he wakes up with stuff in the corner of his eyes in the morning, shows you that there was avir, there was havolim that are yotzim me'ainayim. That's how he explains it. And obviously, when we're talking about havolim, we're not necessarily talking about breath per se, but we're talking about some kind of inyan of ratzo v'shov, which the breath is a symbol of the inyan of ratzo v'shov. It's an example of the inyan of ratzo v'shov. So there's a ratzo v'shov in the oir that comes out of the eyes, out of the ears, out of the nose, out of the mouth, because it's already the bechina of Ak. But that is that madrega, because of its dakustic nature, it's called havolim, it's called hevel. So he's going to explain. Even the hamshocha in oizen choitem peh nikra hevel, and even from the eyes itself, it's also called hevel. It's only ha'ora rather than the etzem of the or itself. In other words, these are madregas in Ak that emerge from Ak, just like the breath emerges from the mouth, the nose, etc. And therefore they're called havolim because they are the madrega of hevel, of ha'ora. Just as the worlds are divided in the etzem mahus. In other words, it's different madregas in the different madrega of Atzilus, Bria, Yitzir, Asiya are not only eichuti. This is not only kamuti, but also eichuti. They're not only in terms of quantity, but in terms of quality. So therefore, we see that the olamos chalukim be'etzem uhusam. Their essential nature is different. The essential nature of Atzilus is completely different from the olam from olam bria. This is a world that's a nivra, and that's a world that's a netzel. It's a completely different thing. And it's the etzem uhus is bechinas ha'orva gilu shabayim kanal, as we explained before. Right? There's a difference in the quality of the oil in them. Similarly with the sefiros. Not only, in other words, is there a difference in riboy, but there's a difference in other words, in kamus, there's also a difference in eichus. As you have in chokhmah ubina, in chokhmah be'etzem hu lamala me'hasoga. Hagan sheb'kol makom bechinas chokhmah hi bechinas yediyah. Chokhmah is not completely lamala mitam badas. It is called the inyan of seichel to some extent or another, even though it's previous of seichel. Nevertheless, it's still an inyan of seichel. It's not lamala min seichel. Mashan ken keser, kmo b'chizah keser be'etzem shelamala mitam badas the gamri. Keser has no shaykhs to tam badas. Kmo inyan aratzon. Like Ratzon, for example, which corresponds to the inyan of Arich, Anpin, and Keser. As we know, there's 3 madregas in Keser. there's Radlo, the highest madrega in Keser, and then Atik, and then Arich. Arich corresponds to Ratzon, Atik corresponds to the inyan of Tainug, and Radlo corresponds to the inyan of Emuna, which the Rebbe actually explains in Hus Inyan HaChasidus, that mimer. What's Ratzon? Ratzon isn't a koyach per se. It's the nefesh itself, but it's the nefesh as it's noited towards something. In other words, it's pushing the nefesh in a certain direction. The Ratzon pushes the nefesh in a certain direction, but it's the nefesh itself. It's not just a koyach. To some kind of thing, without knowing why this is. It's a ratzon. It's not a tam. The true inyan of ratzon is that there's no reason for it. There's no logical explanation. It is because. That's it. Just because. Now it could be that because Tainug is higher than Ratzon. Actually, there's a discussion on this inyan in one of the Mamorim in Samach Vav, whether in fact Tainug and Ratzon are equal, but just in different tenuas, or whether the inyan of Tainug is higher than Ratzon. But there we say that Tainug is higher than Ratzon, but it's not always the case. In any event, he says over here, the sibas haratzon, Tainug can be a siba for ratzon. In other words, it's the thing that motivates ratzon to go in a certain direction. But there is a madrega in ratzon that is not affected by Tainug. That's where ratzon will be equal to Tainug. In any event, there's no reason at all for the etzem haratzon. Gam lo tam kamus, no, even not even a hidden reason. As Hashem is going to explain later. And that also from the previous akes also comes the inner emuna. Sheesh b'kol echad ve'echad meYisrael, sheze b'shorshim v'kinas hakeser shel amal mitam v'das. That is in keser that transcends tam v'das. Rak sheb'emuna v'kinas katnus. Only in emuna this inyan is bekatnus. Why? Because emuna is sometimes regarded as an inyan of immaturity, because it didn't yet come into seichel. And this is the way he's explaining it now. But the etzem inyan of emuna, as the Rebbe explains in Musa Shel Inyan Shel Torah Chasidus, Inyan Shel Torah Chasidus rather, Inyan Shel Torah Chasidus. So the way the Rebbe explains it there is that emuna is L'mayla miratz and l'mayla mitaynu. It's the etzem inyan of a yid. In any event, vayizgalus haratzon hu beru'usa de liba. The Hisoirus Aratzon, the Hisgalus Aratzon rather, not the Hisoirus, the Hisgalus Aratzon. The revelation of Ratzon is in the inner Rusa de Liba, the arousal of the heart, as the Zohar calls it, Rusa de Liba, the Hisoirus Halev, and it's expressed by Iker hu b'mesirus nefesh b'poel mamish. It's expressed in mesirus nefesh b'poel mamish on Kiddush Hashem. That's where the inyan of Ratzon is expressed. In other words, the Ratzon is a Ratzon to be davuk takodesh baruch hu, no matter what. Even if someone is trying to force you to do something and force a person to such an extent that they would have to give up their lives in order not to transgress, that is the etzem inyan of Ratzon, and it's expressed in this inyan mesirus nefesh b'poel mamish al Kiddush Hashem. And we know that Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Baal Shulchan Aruch, wrote another sefer. I'm just can't. The name is escaping me now. Anyway, he wrote sort of more personal. He's Magid Mesharim. Yeah, he wrote the sefer Magid Mesharim. His experience with the Magid, and his Magid told him he had a spiritual teacher called a Magid, and his teacher told him that the reason that he was obligated to write the Shulchan Aruch is because he would not have the privilege of Mesirus Nefesh. Afal that there were many people in his generation that died al Kiddush Hashem by the hands of various shkotzim that were whoever they may happen to be. Nevertheless, he was not considered worthy of dying on Kiddush Hashem, and therefore he was, I suppose you could say, punished in having to write the Shulchan Aruch. That's what he said about himself. In any event, I think we take it with a pinch of salt. He was obviously a very Elech Yid, Rabbi Yosef Karo, and he was definitely the Moira Halacha for all the generations to come. In any event, so the Indian of Kiddush Hashem is Tad Kashrus, his Kashrus Atzmus HaNefesh, excuse me, Ba'atzmus Ein Sof Baruch Hu Shalamal Mitam Adas. That's what it is. And therefore, there's no reasoning when it comes to an Indian of Mesirus Nefesh. There's no reasoning with it. Can't reason with it. It's a beautiful story I just heard from Mendel Futafas. He was in prison. He was put in prisons in Rhine and in the Gulag, and he was actually in prison for 20 years. For 20 years, he was separated from his family. But in one of the prisons that he was in, he got to hear one of the other prisoners told him that one of his buddies, Rabbi Vyshetsky, I forget his first name, was also in the same prison. So somehow he got a message to his to Moshe Vyshetsky, maybe through the same person, whatever, that they should try and meet. They figured out where would they meet best, where would it be possible to meet, by the bathrooms, right? So when you're going to go to the bathroom, probably first thing in the morning, before you say Asher Yotzar, you go to the bathroom. Anyway, Al Kopanim, however they arranged it, they somehow met by the bathroom. And the first thing that Mendel asked his friend, Rabbi Vyshetsky, was, are you ba'atzvus? So he said to him, how is it possible not to be ba'atzvus? There's no matzah on Pesach. There's no kosher food. He started off, I'm away from my family. I don't have tefillin. I can't put on tefillin every day. I'm not, no matzah on Pesach, no lulav and esrog, no sukkah. How's it possible not to be ba'atzvus? So Mendel told him, he said, they captured your body. You can't put on tefillin, you can't eat kosher, and so on. I mean, they survived on bread and water. That was it, right? That was the only kosher food that they could get. So they survived on bread and water, nothing more. In any event, so Mendel told him, your body they captured, right? They have in captivity. But if you're ba'atzvus, they captured your neshama as well. So don't let them capture the etzem and neshama. Since the neshama is miskasher ba'atzmus ein sof, the emes is you have been choirin mitzad your neshama. Okay. And and therefore there's no idea, there's no knowledge, there's no hisbonenus, there's no reasoning when it comes to the inyan of mesirus nefesh. But chokma, not kesed, but chokma is an inyan yediyah. L'chein chokma bechinas or primi, ma she'en kein kesed or makif. Rak shehi l'malim b'tam v'das hamusag. There is an inyan of tam v'das as far as chokma is concerned, but it's not musag. It's not musag in the kalim of bina. V'hainu shebechokma meir or in tzok moshu l'malim v'asoga adayin in chokma v'achokma ma'ayin temotzei, and therefore there's a bechina of ayin in chokma. Right? V'achokma ma'ayin temotzei, there's a bechina of ayin in chokma. So therefore it's l'malim v'asoga adayin u'ma she'leis machshovet tvisa bei. That is what illuminates Chokhmah, this inyan of leis machshovet tfisa bei, machshovet does not grasp HaKadosh Baruch Hu at all. All right, let's do the kitzur quickly. Omnam inyan riba or a miuta or hurakla terech ishtaushlos aspirus emizeh. When you have the inyan riba and mute in the literal sense of the word, in other words, in terms of kamut, in terms of kamus, that's only the ishtaushlos aspirus within a particular world, or the ishtaushlos of the sphere within each sphere. There has to be a reduction of the oil at the lowest level in order that a lower level can emerge from it. So it is with Chokhmah and Bina, the lowest madrega of Chokhmah, Yesod Abba, then transfers to Bina, and Bina to Zoh, and Zoh to Malchus, all through the same kind of process, through Miut Haor. But that's not the Ike inyan malomata. The etzem inyan malomata who shemechulakim beetzem adregas, and it's a difference in eichus, not just in kamus. And that's why there's a difference in kamus. That some sphera is higher sphera has more oil, a lower sphera has less oil, because it's a different madrega be'eichus. And he gives an example. The ark, Mila, ark is on a high madrega because the etzema or. I'm sorry, not the etzema or as a madrega in or, but the or itself is in ark. Masha ein kain in atzilus, it's only the metzius of the or, not the atzmus or. Vakol bechinas havolim the ark, and all of the inyonim in ark are bechinas havolim. It's only the inyan of metzius. In ark, as we said before, that's the inyan of the etzema or is there. Same thing would happen in Chokhmah Bina. Chokhmah is on a high madrega because it's shaykh to the etzem haor. Mashain kain Bina is only the metzius. Chokhmah be'etzem l'malam yasoga v'miyoysa yediyah. And even though Chokhmah is an inyan in Vidya, nevertheless, it transcends the regular intellect. And it's on a higher madrega than Bina because it's L'malim Asoga. And the whole inyan of Bina is Asoga. And Meir Ba in Chokhmah or in Tzok L'malim Asoga, it illuminates Chokhmah as it is L'malim Asoga. And that's why Chokhmah is called that's the Chokhmah. That's the madrega of Chokhmah, as Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, I think Perek Lamed Hey. Hu ends Lasa Zohi madrega Chokhmah. That's what he says. That inyan of Orin Sok Moshe Hu L'malim Asoga, that's what's made in Chokhmah, and therefore it is a higher madrega Mamela than Bina. It's a high in Eichus, and therefore it's essentially higher than Bina. It's not just an inyan of Kamus. Okay.
Is this approach somewhat contrasting all the previous Mihalach that sefiros in the or? So now it seems to be the emphasis on the keli itself. That
no, I think he's saying Adarabah. I think he's saying that it's not just the kelim that which is the inyan of ribu and miut, but rather the or itself is a different madrega. The or itself, the or of Chokhmah is a different madrega than the or of Bina.
Okay.
It's a chiluk in the or itself. Good point. All right. We stop there. All right, Rabbi Islam, Be'ez Hashem next week.
Okay.
All righty.
Yeah, Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Qualitative.